Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. A Bloomberg Exclusive. Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa says his government plans to rebuild Gaza with the help of President Trump and Saudi Arabia, with Hamas and Israel removed from the territory. AI dominates big tech earnings and a new deal emerges. Softbank is in talks to invest as much as $25 billion into OpenAI. And Fed Chair Jerome Powell signals the central bank is happy to stay on hold as the Trump administration's policies take shape. Well, it's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Johannesburg in Dubai. In a short while, we're going to bring you that exclusive Bloomberg interview with the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister. So plenty to get through there. But first, let's just start with markets. Big day yesterday for anyone trading and taking a look at how the U.S. economy is evolving with the Fed meeting. And initially, the market interpreted some of the comments coming through from the Fed Chair Jerome Powell as slightly hawkish. But by the end of the session and after the press conference finished, we were sort of back to where we were as far as treasuries were concerned, 10-year yields sort of ending back where they were before the presser began. But for Wall Street, we did see a bit of a dip before the after-hours big tech earnings came through. Today, you can see futures are leaning towards the green. S&P up about 0.4%. The Nasdaq up 0.7%. Big earnings did come through in the form of Meta, Microsoft, and Tesla. We'll talk more about that and what we learned from them. But for most of those stocks, they are trading up in after hours. Today, the attention is going to turn to Apple and, of course, GDP prints coming out of the U.S. as well. Brent slipping a little bit, too, down to around $76 handle. 76.5 is where we're at now. And that is on back of a larger than expected crude stockpile that came through yesterday. In fact, this is the biggest jump in U.S. stockpile since last November. So something to bear in mind as we think about the fundamentals driving the energy complex here. And then we're taking a look at the euro this morning. We're trading at around 104 handle. Of course, it is a big day in Europe. ECB coming up today. The market is anticipating them to go for a 25 basis point cut. And there onwards, the market is pricing in 2 more subsequent cuts or thereabouts. But the question is how quickly they're going to go and what are the signals we're going to get out of the ECB, given that the growth backdrop is rather weak. And don't forget that vis-a-vis the Eurozone, you get the first look at a Q1 GDP later today as well. So all that coming up. As for our terminal chart today, I did mention briefly that we had a bit of a mixed reaction in 10-year U.S. Treasuries. But if you look at where 10-year yields have been over the past month, there's been somewhat of a resistance at around 4.5%. That appears to be the center of gravity. Yesterday, initially, we spiked up to around 4.58. Now we're back down to around 4.52 again. And this, as the market sort of figures out what the Fed's next steps are going to be. But as of now, the market is pricing in 43 basis points worth of cuts for the rest of this year. So bear that in mind as we talk further about the Fed and the Fed Chair Jerome Powell's comments. But let's go to our big story in the region this morning. The Palestinian Authority Prime Minister says his government wants to rebuild Gaza with help from the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia. But that would require Israeli forces leaving the territory and removing Hamas from power. Mohammad Mustafa spoke exclusively with Bloomberg about how he sees that happening.
Distinguish between governing Gaza and being part of life in Gaza.
Okay.
Hamas represents a group of people who are Palestinians.
Of course.
They're normal Palestinians. They have a certain political orientation, but they're also normal citizens. And every citizen in Palestine has the same rights and same obligations. So from our perspective, they're all...
But do you see them in any governing role? What about their guns and all of that? What about disarming them and their governing role? What's your view of what should happen?
We believe that, to start with, they should have not administered Gaza.
They should have?
Not administered Gaza.
To begin with, they should have. But what now?
Now they have to give up administration of Gaza.
And how's that going to happen?
Well, luckily they have been saying this publicly. They have been saying, we will not govern Gaza. So I will have to take this at face value.
What about their guns?
And their guns has to be dealt with. And I'm sure, as you know, the first phase of the ceasefire is now being implemented, and that's good news. We heard, as you know, the last few days that a new round of discussions, which should start on the 16th day of the ceasefire, will start negotiating other issues. We heard today that actually it's already started. So that's good news too. We want to see that progressing, and part of that process will lead to the issue of governance and the issue of security arrangements. From our perspective, in a nutshell, we consider the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian government as the legitimate sole administrator of Gaza, just like the West Bank. And therefore we expect the one government, one system, one institution, one police force, etc., etc. And we therefore expect that Hamas as a party will not govern. It can be part of the political life, it can be part of the social life, it can be part of the cultural life. So in that regard, we will engage with everybody, not only with Hamas, with all parts of our society, private sector, civil society, in order to rebuild Gaza, rebuild the institutions of Gaza, rebuild the economy of Gaza, establish law and order, and focus on the political track as soon as possible.
Now you have these hundreds of thousands of people in the last few days going back to neighborhoods that have been leveled by the Israeli military in recent months.
Yes.
So the question is, what's going to happen to these folks? President Trump has made a surprising suggestion that they should be temporarily moved somewhere else. Do you think there's any future to this suggestion?
I don't think so, no. I think our people have demonstrated over many years that what they want is to live like any people in the world, in their own country. And therefore they're determined to continue to live in Gaza and in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem.
But what if it were temporary, just to sort of make the place, to fix the place up? Do you think you don't trust that?
No, we can fix the place without that.
You don't need to move them?
No, we don't need to move them. What they want, what they need now, and that answers your other part of your question, is immediately providing them with adequate shelter.
Like temporary housing?
Temporary housing. That's what's needed immediately. Because building new homes, so many of them, with the right infrastructure will take time. And that's where probably some people concern is coming from. But the answer to that is, let's immediately, I mean now, get hundreds of thousands of temporary housing units into Gaza, develop the infrastructure, the water, electricity needed to support that as soon as possible. That should be the priority of the international community in coordination with us.
And to link that to what you said earlier, is your notion that if you have a real rebuilding process that involves the Gulf countries like the Saudis, that it creates a process in which this system can produce a new Palestinian entity?
Absolutely.
That's the goal.
Absolutely. I mean,
it's sort of work on the ground and create a political entity.
Exactly. Work on the ground, help people get out of the misery they are in today.
And that will also shift their political affiliation, maybe.
I think the shifting has already started. We just need to reinforce it, and give people hope, a pathway forward in terms of shelter, basic services restored, including water, electricity, health, education, work immediately on planning the reconstruction. I'm pleased to report to you that our reconstruction plan is almost ready. We've been working on it with the World Bank, United Nations, and the European Union. Before I met you a few hours ago. They were here, presented, discussed together the plan. So we're ready. So that's what people want. We want, if we can show them that we care about them, and we're doing everything we can as State of Palestine, but also as our partners in the region and international community.
Well, that was the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa speaking exclusively to Bloomberg in Ramallah in the West Bank. Also worth flagging that it was his first international media interview since he became Prime Minister about a year ago. To talk more about this interview, let's bring in Stuart Livingston-Wallace, our executive editor for MENA and Russia. Really interesting to sit down with the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister. And of course, they only have governance over parts of the West Bank, just to clarify to the audience and viewers. But interesting to hear his commentary around how he sees the evolution of the future of Gaza. What stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think what was most interesting was how measured it was. You know, it was it was a lengthy interview, number one, but also he was very methodical in sort of working through the thought processes for how you get this done. And there's absolutely no denying this is going to be an enormous task to try and rebuild Gaza and then have something resembling solid governance there.
I thought it was pretty interesting that he also seemed to reject the idea of any possibility of Hamas retaining governance in Gaza as well.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really blame him. I mean, I think the majority of people would argue or agree that having a heavily armed militant group is probably not the optimal layout for good governance going forward. I mean, they did rule Gaza for basically a generation, and yes, there were elements of Hamas that were definitely providing services. But, you know, net, you ended up with the situation you have now. So I think from that point of view, it seems entirely sensible to say that we completely need to rethink how this thing is going to be governed. Whether most of his key points are actually achievable, now that is a much tougher one to argue, because there's a lot of people involved in this that are opposed to the principal points that he's laying out.
Yeah, and not really a surprise that he joined also the condemnation of President Trump's comments earlier this week vis-a-vis moving people out of Gaza. But he did seem to suggest that there is a need for temporary housing. Do we have any understanding of what the plan is to house all of these residents trying to return back to the northern part of Gaza?
No, I mean, I think the bottom line is there isn't one. Because we're still at that stage where we have this incredibly fragile ceasefire. You know, we're kind of at, what are we, week 3, I suppose, week 2, week 3. There's an awful long way to go until, number one, the hostages are out. Number two, we get some sort of resolution on what is the future of Israel there. Now, he's pointed out that ultimately he thinks a peaceful Gaza cannot happen while Israel remains in the enclave, as well as Hamas, of course.
Just one final quick one. Saudi Arabia came up. Very interesting point as well. It really does feel like the kingdom are playing a more active role in terms of what happens next in the region and to promote regional security.
Yeah, and to be clear, I mean, he did talk also about the Gulf countries. I think Qatar and the UAE and so on are going to play an important role in this, as well as Egypt and Jordan, of course. But yes, Saudi Arabia, one of the big power brokers in the region, it's now actively involved in lots of places, including Syria. And of course, it has those deep pockets and it has that influence. And overarching all of this is some sense maybe we end up with some normalization with Israel as part of a much wider deal.
Yeah, that's the longer-term plan. Stuart Livingston-Wallace, thank you so much, our executive editor for MENA and Russia. Now, the Syrian rebel group that ousted Bashar al-Assad last month says it has dissolved parliament, dismantled the country's armed apparatus, and appointed its de facto leader, the country's new president. State media reports the moves are meant to clear the way for a political transition. In a statement, the rebel commander says Hayat Tahrir al-Sham leader Ahmed al-Sharaa will be president during a transitional period. It did not give any time frame for elections or drafting a new constitution. Coming up, mid-air collision, a passenger jet and helicopter crashed near Washington, D.C.'s Reagan Airport. We get you the latest details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. A passenger jet with 64 people on board has collided in midair with a military helicopter in Washington, D.C., prompting a search and rescue operation in the freezing waters of the Potomac River. Bloomberg aviation reporter Danny Lee has been following developments and join us now. Danny, pretty shocking to hear about what's gone down in Washington, D.C. now. This collision, you have a commercial jet colliding with a military helicopter. What details do we know?
Yeah, this accident happened on Wednesday night, so a couple of hours ago at 9 p.m. just outside Ronald Reagan Airport in Washington, D.C. And this collision and the subsequent event this now a search and rescue operation, which is concentrated over the Potomac River. And so we don't have any word at the moment on any survivors or fatalities, in fact. And there is concern growing in the fact that there are a number of fatalities. And as you said, American Airlines has confirmed to Bloomberg that there are 64 passengers and crew on board the regional jet, which is operated for American Airlines. And then we have at least 3 soldiers on board the helicopter. So the situation is a little bit unclear at the moment, given it's nightfall. But there is a huge activity at the moment down by the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., to find any survivors at the very least and see what else can be done in this initial aftermath.
Yeah. Well, FAA already put out a statement on the crash saying that the FAA and the NTSB will be investigating. The NTSB will be leading the investigation, will be providing updates as the information comes in. What else have we heard from the likes of the president and other lawmakers in D.C.?
Yeah, there was a swift reaction in the nation's capital, and President Donald Trump says he was monitoring the situation very closely. As well, we heard from the likes of new U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and the new Transport Secretary Sean Duffy as well. They're both actively monitoring, and likewise the departments are. And for both especially, just quite a baptism of fire, given they've only just really been installed into their positions. And so, the reactions have been very swift, and lots of concentration around the political leaders and others monitoring this situation. Clearly a grim one and a grim night to come.
Yeah, and we're going to keep an eye on all of the developments as they occur and bring them to you. Bloomberg transport reporter Danny Lee, thank you very much. Well, still ahead, we'll get the market outlook with BlackRock Investment Institute as traders weigh up Fed Chair Jerome Powell's rate clues and a round of tech earnings. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in Dubai. Well, investors are assessing the Fed's rate pause and mixed earnings from U.S. big tech companies. Let's bring in Ben Powell, Chief Middle East and APAC Investment Strategist at BlackRock Investment Institute. Well, the day after the Fed, we're going to have to bring in another Powell. I'm sure you've heard that one before. Did you learn anything new from the press conference yesterday? Anything that has changed your assessment of where the interest rate policy is going?
Good morning, Giovanni. Great to be with you. Not really. I think what we learnt is Chair Powell, the other one, as you say, Chair Powell, he's very keen not to be the story, right? So it really reminded me of the Simpsons meme of Homer trying to disappear back into the hedge.
Bushes.
He explicitly said, we're trying to keep our heads down.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lot going on in the world, I think it's fair to say, including in fiscal policy, regulatory policy. So the Fed, like everyone, I think, is waiting to see and calibrating their response. But they can't do that until they have a much better sense of actually what the new administration might do. And they don't know yet, like all of us, I guess.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to note his slight nuances on inflation. I mean, you know what rates traders do. They parse out every little tiny piece of information. But he was saying that they would like to see serial readings of inflation progress before adjusting rates again. And that, for me, is a slight shift of tone versus where they were last year. Because towards the end of the year last year, it was almost like they were giving themselves a tap on the back and saying, we're pretty confident that inflation is heading back to target. Now let's focus on the labor market. Now it's shifted back again to focusing on the inflation mandate and seeing what pans out with these upcoming inflation prints.
I think that's right, and I think that reflects a genuine increase in uncertainty all around the world. So we've got, we at BlackRock talk about mega forces. So this is the AI revolution. How disinflationary could AI be? Potentially a lot. When and how much, we don't know. Trade tensions, tariffs, relocating supply chains. There's just so much going on. I think it's completely appropriate for the Fed to kind of fess up and say, hey, we don't have a magic crystal ball. Like everyone, we're waiting for the data. And what they won't do is try and pretend they have a clear position on exactly where we're going to be in a year or two's time. So I think their humility and their sort of realistic appraisal of it's a really complicated world is completely appropriate, and we will not, sadly for many bond traders, they're not going to tell us what is going to happen next month or next year because they don't know.
What's your house view for where the terminal rate is in this cycle?
So we think they'll do a couple more. They'll get to 4, and really the reason for our thinking on that is that's where we think the long-term neutral rate is. So this is a big debate. Nobody really knows exactly where it is, but we think they're probably a little bit restrictive still, and importantly, the Fed agrees with that. So Powell did say he still thinks, I think, meaningfully or significantly restrictive. I forget the adjective, but they still think they're a bit tight. So if the economy continues to be pretty strong and inflation does make that progress that you're talking to, Johanna, I think they will want to come down to neutral. We think that's 4. It's a debate in the community, but we think probably a couple more through the remainder of the year, and then just kind of chill out and see how we're going.
Neutral at 4% is pretty high. What do you think matters more for global markets? What the Fed end up doing with the interest rate cycle, or what happens in the NASDAQ and broader equity markets the next couple of weeks with the arrival of DeepSeek?
I really think this is a big change, maybe from the last 20 years, whereby central bankers, of course, still important, but maybe not as important as business leaders, allocation of capital, the creativity, developing the companies, the technologies of the future, and fiscal policy, right? More than fiscal policy, let's say government policy. So I think central bankers, of course, still very important, but famously they were the only game in town for 10 or 15 years. I think that's really not true anymore. So to answer your question directly, I kind of think it's presidents and country leaders and business leaders, and then the Fed kind of trying actively to take a more passive role, as it were, as they follow the lead of these, as I say, industrial titans and business government leaders globally.
Has DeepSeek upended the narrative that U.S. is winning the AI race?
Not really, no. I still think Silicon Valley is a unique kind of nexus of capital markets, intellectual capital, all of that. I still think that's true. But what I also think is true is AI is going to be adopted. So you have the kind of the brilliant ideas and the production, and that's still, for the moment, sort of a Silicon Valley thing. Not entirely, to your point on DeepSeek. But I think what we were woken up to this week is this is potentially going to become much more mainstream in terms of adoption than we were thinking perhaps just a few weeks ago. So AI, it isn't just going to be kind of locked out in the genius fringe. It's going to become usable in a cheap and kind of accessible way much more quickly perhaps than the market was anticipating just a week ago. So maybe at the margin, some of the excitement, which we think continues, but at the margin, some of the excitement moves from the producer-creators of the tech to the user adopter of the tech.
Yeah, some people have been calling it the commoditization, the beginning of commoditization of AI. Ben, always good to chat to you. Ben Powell, Chief Middle East and APAC Investment Strategist at BlackRock Investment Institute. Well, coming up, Softbank is in talks for a $25 billion investment in OpenAI. We discuss all the details coming up next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. A Bloomberg Exclusive. Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa says his government plans to rebuild Gaza with the help of President Trump and Saudi Arabia, with Hamas and Israel removed from the territory. AI dominates big tech earnings and a new deal emerges. Softbank is in talks to invest as much as $25 billion into OpenAI. And Fed Chair Jay Powell signals the central bank is happy to stay on hold as the Trump administration's policies take shape. Well, it's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Johanna Bersetchi in Dubai, also getting you up to speed on all of the latest developments coming out of D.C. with reports in the last half an hour that a collision has occurred between a commercial jet and a helicopter. So we will keep bringing you developments from that as and when. A big story, breaking news. And as you can see, these are live pictures coming through from D.C. now as we get more information about what exactly has occurred. The U.S. Army is saying that the helicopter involved in the crash was coming from Fort Belvoir. So these are live images from DC. We'll circle back to them once we get more information. Let's flip back to markets, though. Yesterday, big day, obviously, with the Fed meeting. The Wall Street close was slightly negative for both the S&P and NASDAQ, but you can see today futures are leaning towards the green again, up 0.4%, 0.7%, respectively. We're going to talk in a moment about some of the big tech earnings that came through yesterday, the likes of Microsoft, Meta, Tesla, and then today investors are looking forward to Apple as well, Apple earnings, and perhaps some of the commentary around China and exposure to China there is going to be key for direction. We also get U.S. GDP. I'll mention that in a moment, but first, Brent trading at around $76, about 0.1% weaker. U.S. stockpiles continue to grow, putting some pressure on the energy complex, and then Euro trading sideways as we head into that ECB meeting. 25 basis points cut is priced in, but the focus will be on the commentary vis-a-vis forward guidance. Flipping over, though, I said that U.S. GDP is coming up today. The market is anticipating a slight moderation in terms of the print from where we were the last quarter. U.S. GDP is expected to decelerate and to come in at around 2.6% from 3.1% in the prior quarter. And, of course, personal consumption continues to be the main driver of growth in the U.S. economy. Now, on to another big story today. Bloomberg has learned that Softbank is in talks to invest as much as $25 billion into OpenAI. That would be in addition to its multi-billion-dollar commitment to the Stargate AI infrastructure venture. Now, Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst Robert Lee joins us for more. Robert, good to have you back on again. Another AI story today. Let's talk about Softbank's proposal, the reports that they're looking to invest up to $25 billion into OpenAI. First of all, where are they going to get the money from? And how soon can they expect to make a return on investment?
Okay, yeah, thanks for having me back on again, and good question. If you recall, it was only a week or so ago that Elon Musk questioned this himself. Masayoshi-san always talks a great story. He's always very ambitious. Clearly, he's repositioned SoftBank as an AI play. But at the end of the day, the company's cash reserves are somewhat limited. I think one thing I've said previously, that there is potential for them to maybe realize some of their investment gains, particularly on their holding on ARM Holdings, the US-listed British semiconductor stock. But their headway, or headroom, I should say, on their current bond holdings is somewhat limited. So I think Musk's earlier comment was justified to a large degree. These are big numbers they're talking about, going back to Stargate, $500 billion over 5 years or so. Where's the money going to come from? And would it make a return on investment? I think if you look at SoftBank's recent financial history, it's been somewhat checkered, I would say. Again, Masayoshi-san talks a great story, but we need to see a return. We need to see these companies monetize these investments.
Yeah, well, we know with SoftBank, when they swing big. So that sort of falls into that category. Speaking of big, let's talk about Meta and some of the commentary that came through yesterday from Mark Zuckerberg. He was pretty optimistic about their AI hopes for this year, predicting a really big year in AI, but also expecting their AI assistant to reach over 1 billion people this year. What do we make of this optimism, Rob?
I think... Again, on their market reach, obviously, this company is still, again, a ubiquitous part of the social media industry globally. Facebook has an enormous reach, and also Instagram, etc. So I don't disagree with him on that. But again, it comes back to monetization. There's been sort of mixed opinions and mixed views on how quickly Meta is likely to monetize these, enormous, humongous amounts of capex they're putting in. It was confirmed a week or so ago, again, that they're investing $65 billion in capex this year. And based on our analysts' view in the US, that is going to progressively squeeze their margins through this year. There's already evidence of that coming through. And I think if you look at the consensus numbers, this business is forecast to deliver earnings growth or net income growth of around 7 to 8%. So I think, again, whilst Zuckerberg talks a great story, whilst they're heavily investing in AI, I don't think they're monetizing it anywhere fast enough. And actually, the incremental investment is actually going to squeeze their margins. 7% net income growth for a large tech platform doesn't really cut it, I would say.
Yeah. And speaking of growth, let's talk about Microsoft, because, again, it feels as though investors are really nitpicking here. Investors were disappointed by the fact that they said their Azure cloud division will grow as much as 32%, slightly slower than what it was in the prior quarter. But it feels as though Microsoft are running up against some capacity constraints. So just talk us through what we learned from Microsoft yesterday.
Okay, I would say in contrast with the other two companies we just talked about, the outlook at Microsoft remains much more upbeat. They're far more broadly spread in defensive business. Their Azure cloud computing business is, a leading cloud supplier and clearly benefiting from the strong ongoing investments on the AI side. Their backlog, or order book numbers they quoted, are fantastically strong. The issue for them is capacity constraints. So whilst they are a very different business from NVIDIA, they face the same sort of... it's a good problem to have, perhaps. Demand is continuing to outstrip supply. So that will take the edge off some of their growth in the near term. But, they are supremely positioned, I would say, on the fundamental side. And at least there is a hope of them monetizing. We're seeing that coming through. So I think relative to the other two, Microsoft is in a much better position.
Yeah, well, it's all about monetization, exactly as you say. A Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst, Robert Lee, thank you for your reporting. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following today. President Trump has withdrawn an order freezing federal grants, loans, and financial assistance. While the order had been temporarily blocked by a federal judge, the decision is the first big policy reversal of his new term. Trump defended the freeze as a chance to review spending.
There was a short-term pause or funding freeze on certain discretionary spending payments, such as government grants, only for us to quickly look at the scams, dishonesty, waste, and abuse that's taken place in our government for too long. As was explicitly stated, this in no way affected Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or other entitlements that Americans depend on.
And Bloomberg has learned that the Trump administration is exploring additional curbs on the sale of NVIDIA chips to China. Sources say officials are focused on chips used for AI development that have already been scaled down to meet existing restrictions. NVIDIA shares fell, extending a rocky week for the chipmaker. Alibaba is touting what it calls world-leading performance for its new AI model, Qwen 2.5 Max. In a post on WeChat, the Chinese company says it scores better in various tests and benchmarks than the latest models from Meta, OpenAI, Anthropic, and its upstart domestic rival, DeepSeek. Nissan shares are higher following reports it plans to cut a work shift at 2 U.S. assembly plants and trim its hourly staff via buyouts. Renault, meanwhile, is said to be demanding a premium for its 36% stake in Nissan if Honda takes control. Bloomberg transport reporter Danny Lee joins us now. Danny, good to have you with us now, reporting on this story. So Nissan, Honda, the news of the merger broke a couple of weeks back. Now it seems as though Renault are wading into the discussion. They're demanding a premium for their stake. What do we know?
Yeah, absolutely. France's Renault has been communicating that it wants to see a premium on the 36% stake it holds, and that's been communicated to Honda. It holds a stake in Nissan, and irrespective of this effective takeover by Honda of Nissan, Renault wants to see a premium on that, and so therefore it has made that clear in the last week or so about getting that full value from that stake. And so, yeah, there is a lot of news circling around Nissan as this effective merger and takeover moves ahead at a pace.
And of course, the company is under a lot of pressure to reform, restructure. We were just talking about some of their plans in the U.S., employee buyouts at 3 U.S. plants. What do we know about what their plans are for the rest of this year in terms of the full company restructuring?
Yeah, I mean, we are hearing a drip feed of details from Nissan on what it needs to do in the near term, particularly getting its house in order before this potential merger takeover concludes. Obviously, in the US, that is going to be cutting output and cutting job shifts in order to right-size its business to where the demand is at the moment. Obviously, it's symbolic of the current struggles it's facing, but that means it wants to see jobs cut, particularly wants to see buyouts and early retirements rather than cutting jobs outright. And so, therefore, it's looking to right-size as a result. But globally, it's said it's going to be cutting 9,000 jobs. And so, a lot of these jobs will ultimately be lost out of production, given the struggles it's facing, to support that production with the demand for its vehicles. And Nissan comes into this being the weaker player out of itself versus Honda here. So, yeah, lots of developments coming through in the weeks and months.
And we haven't even talked about the EV competition that's been coming through from China as well. So big story as well for the car sector. Bloomberg transport reporter Danny Lee, thank you so much. Now coming up, more from our exclusive interview with the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa. This is Bloomberg.
Season is here.
Kicking off earnings season, there's a lot going on.
Bloomberg is first to break the numbers.
Air France KLM.
NatWest well above estimates.
We have further earnings coursing from GSK.
With the smartest insights.
Clearly, the macro and geopolitical front is full of open issues that if they come all together at one stage, they can create some dislocation.
Is that why you're cautious about the fourth quarter?
Continuing coverage on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Let's get more from our exclusive interview with the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa, who says they are relying on the support of Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region in the massive task of rebuilding Gaza.
Saudi Arabia has said that openly and publicly that they want to engage, they want to have a more integrated, more peaceful region, but he also said that without the Palestinian statehood issue is addressed in the right way, nothing will happen.
Right.
So we do count on the support of our brothers in Saudi Arabia and the region, and of course many countries around the world that has been supportive of our cause and Palestinian statehood. As you know, we have about 149 countries do recognize Palestine, despite all the challenges and difficulties and etc. So we have every reason to believe that this is doable. It is tough, it is difficult, but maybe the time has finally come.
So if the time has come, it's going to have to run through Washington with the new Trump administration. This is a delicate situation for you because the PA's relationship with the Trump administration, the last Trump administration, was somewhat strained. Tell us how it's going in the first weeks of this administration.
I think I have every reason to believe that this administration will actually help us all do the right deal, a balanced deal that could hopefully end the conflict in the region.
And do you have that feeling because of a relationship that you've started with the president or with people around him?
Well, I think, as I said, I mean, the good news here, if you like, is that there's the bilateral dimension, but there is also the regional dimensions and the global dimension. Everybody in the world now wants to see Palestinians have their own state. Everybody in Europe wants to see that. Many people in the U.S., but also many people in the United Nations system and many countries in the region. So it's a public, it's kind of the right thing to do, if you like. And I think the momentum that we have seen, even before the administration officially started on January 20th, their engagement from day one, as you know, Steve Witkoff is in the region. He will probably in Gaza today, as he said.
Yes, he was.
So that shows engagement and interest, and he's obviously taken time to discover the place and learn about what's going on. And I'm sure that this will be very helpful.
Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa speaking exclusively to Bloomberg's Ethan Bronner in Ramallah. Now, coming up, the DRC's president warns of unpredictable consequences after Rwandan-backed rebels seize the eastern city of Goma. More on the international response to the conflict next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in Dubai. Democratic Republic of Congo President Felix Tshisekedi is warning of, quote, unpredictable consequences for the region. This after Rwandan-backed rebels seized the eastern city of Goma. Tshisekedi says his government is preparing a response to the conflict. Meanwhile, Rwanda denies backing the rebels or having troops in Congo.
M23 are not Rwandans, please. These are Congolese, and one time he accepts it, then another time he says no, part of it is yes, and then the other part is from Rwanda, and these are He keeps on going. And how do we, leaders of our own countries, accept this to go on forever?
For more, Bloomberg's Nziro Ganga joins us now from Kigali, Rwanda. You've been on this story all week, and certainly we're beginning to hear more now from heads of states in surrounding countries. What stood out to you from the extraordinary heads of state summit that took place in the last 24 hours, Nziro?
Hi, Jumana. So this meeting was first scheduled way later on in the evening. So we woke up to news that the summit had actually happened. And if you listen to President Paul Kagame, he looks and he sounds very frustrated, not only with the fighting in DRC, but also how Rwanda has been roped into the whole situation. International bodies like the UN and the US have accused Rwanda of backing M23 rebels, an allegation that you just had in the soundbite, him denying and saying Rwanda is not backing M23 rebels. But it looks like this narrative has seeped into the region and blame is being exchanged. There's a lot of finger pointing behind closed doors. And case in point, President Paul Kagame says his South African counterpart, Cyril Ramaphosa, called him. They've had a conversation, yet the context of their discussion is being heavily distorted by South African officials, the president included. And he says, I quote, if South Africa wants to contribute to a peaceful solution, that is well and good, but South Africa is in no position to take the role of a peacemaker or mediator. And this is after South Africa has lost 13 soldiers in the fighting so far, and pressure is mounting back home. But the other elephant in the room was DRC's President Felix Tshisekedi was missing during this virtual meeting. Instead, he addressed his people through a televised address where he called for resilience and resistance.
And of course, all of these conversations are happening at the same time as the situation in Goma has been on the international radar. How is the situation right now in the eastern part of Congo? What does it look like? How has the evolution been just in the last couple of days?
It's a mixed bag of goods. You have some that have hope. They're going back home after crossing over the border, seeking refuge in Rwanda. They're beginning to cross back into Congo. Then you have fear still lurking in the environment. We're seeing experts leaving. We're seeing some of the contracted mercenaries leaving. And there's also anger. There are protesters that invaded some embassies, including Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and the UN building. And they burned a couple of tires outside of these premises. But also, despite the fact that there are calls for ceasefire, the Rwandan regional ambassador expects M23 to keep charging forward in the south of Kivu unless this dialogue, and President Felix Tshisekedi has not shown any interest in dialogue with M23.
Yeah, super interesting. Bloomberg's Nziro Ganga in Kigali, Rwanda. Thank you for bringing us the latest. Now, Nigeria's imports of gasoline are on course for an 8-year low. That's as the country's new mega refinery pushes out foreign suppliers, boosting the nation's fuel independence. The Dangote refinery is bigger than any other in Europe or Africa. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso officially left the Economic Community of West African States Union yesterday. The exit of the three nations, all under military rule, has raised concerns about regional stability and trade. ECOWAS is open to dialogue and is considering options to address security concerns, including reactivating a standby force. Meanwhile, the three countries are preparing a joint force to deploy in the Sahel region. The African Development Bank will finance a 300-kilometer transmission line to export power generated in Uganda to neighboring South Sudan, where access to electricity is about 5%. Uganda is waiting for parliamentary and cabinet approvals to begin construction of the line. The lender has committed about $189 million, including a $122 million loan for Uganda and a $33 million grant for South Sudan. So getting you up to speed on some of the latest news coming from the African continent. But of course, it has been a mega 24 hours for markets, stock markets. The major event yesterday, the Fed meeting, where investors didn't get a lot of information about the Fed's path ahead. The tone that was taken on by the Fed Chair Jerome Powell was somewhat more cautious. He said that they would need to see a little bit more time in terms of inflation progress, to assess inflation progress, would want to see serial readings of that progress before adjusting rates again. Before the meeting, the market was pricing in 30% probability of a rate cut as soon as March. That's now been dialed down to around 15%. So pretty much wiped out expectations of an imminent rate cut at the next meeting after the Fed meeting took place. And of course, it wasn't just that. We had mega cap earnings yesterday, a whole bunch reporting after hours, with the likes of Tesla reporting that stock is trading up 5% in the after hours market now. Microsoft as well. Small disappointment on the growth of their cloud unit. Azure guiding to slightly slower growth than what they've had in prior quarters, but also talking about some capacity constraints in data centers, given how strong demand is. And so the stock did actually eventually recover after an initial dip once the earnings came out. And then the other big one that came through was Meta. Mark Zuckerberg sounding really optimistic about AI and their ability to monetize on their AI pilots. He thinks that they're going to be able to roll it out to 1 billion users by the end of this year. So as we head into the European session, this is the picture for futures. Everything is leaning towards green. S&P futures up 0.4%, NASDAQ up about 2/3 as we head into the European session. Don't forget, ECB meeting is coming up later today as well. And coming up in the next hour, we'll talk more about the Fed, tech earnings, and more with our guests Shane Oliver and Luis Costa. I'm Jumana Bersecci in Dubai. Stay with us for the second hour as Jen joins me from Johannesburg. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. A Bloomberg Exclusive, Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa says his government plans to rebuild Gaza with the help of President Trump and Saudi Arabia, with Hamas and Israel removed from the territory. AI dominates big tech earnings, and a new deal emerges. Softbank is in talks to invest as much as $25 billion into OpenAI. And a passenger jet with 64 people on board crashes in Washington after mid-air collision with a military helicopter. Well, good morning again. It's just gone 9 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Johanna Bersecci in Dubai.
And I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg, where it's just gone past 7 a.m. Welcome to the second hour of Horizons Middle East and Africa. And Jumana, of course, another busy day for markets and for politics, and a lot of news that's coming in this morning.
Yeah, so we're keeping very close track of the developments coming out of Washington, D.C., with the news coming in just an hour ago that a commercial jet collided with a military helicopter. We are just getting word now, this is per CBS, that 18 bodies have now been recovered in that D.C. aircraft accident. This is per CBS. We know that officials are planning to hold their first press briefing about the accident in about half an hour's time. So we will dip into that press conference as it happens. But this is just the latest developments, and these are live shots coming out of that Reagan Airport in D.C. after the mid-air crash between that commercial jet flown by American Airlines with a military helicopter. So this is what is taking place now. And what we do know per CBS is that 18 bodies have now been recovered in that incident, and awaiting to hear more information on further casualties as we await that press conference in about half an hour's time. So we will loop back to that. A check on markets after the Fed meeting yesterday. What we are seeing is S&P futures, NASDAQ futures are leaning towards the green. This after a Fed press conference that didn't yield a lot in terms of what the Fed is going to do next. The Fed Chair Jerome Powell sounded rather cautious on inflation progress, but the market was quick to unprice some of the rate cuts priced into the market. Now only about 43 basis points priced in until the rest of the year. Brent dipping a little bit, the energy complex coming under some selling pressure here, down 0.2% with the bigger stockpile crude in the U.S. And then euro in focus today, trading sideways, ECB meeting coming up. The market is pretty much set on a 25 basis point cut and 2 more cuts in the coming months. But again, these statements will be pieced and parsed for any inclination of further dovishness and further cuts to come. As for U.S. Treasury yields, I thought it was interesting yesterday. We had a bit of a roller coaster ride for the reaction and 10-year yields. Right after the initial statement came out, we shot up to 4.58% in yield terms. By the end of the session, though, we were back down to 4.52 as Fed Chair Jerome Powell dialed back some of the initial interpretations to his remarks around inflation and inflation progress. But you can see from this that in the past month, 10-year yields has really found a lot of support around 4.5%, which is where we're sitting at right now. As for regional news, the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister says his government wants to rebuild Gaza with help from the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia. But that would require Israeli forces leaving the territory and removing Hamas from power. Mohammad Mustafa spoke exclusively with Bloomberg about how he sees that happening.
Distinguish between governing Gaza and being part of life in Gaza.
Okay.
When Hamas represents a group of people who are Palestinians.
Of course.
They're normal Palestinians. They have a certain political orientation, but they're also normal citizens. And then, every citizen in Palestine has the same rights and same obligations. So from our perspective, they're all...
But do you see them in any governing role? What about their guns and all of that? What about disarming them and their governing role? What's your view of what should happen there?
We believe that, to start with, they should have not administered Gaza.
They should have?
Not administered Gaza.
To begin with. They shouldn't have. But what now?
Now they have to give up administration of Gaza.
And how's that going to happen?
Well, luckily they have been saying this publicly. They have been saying, we will not govern Gaza. So I will have to take this at face value.
What about their guns?
And their guns has to be dealt with. And I'm sure, as you know, the first phase of the ceasefire is now being implemented, and that's good news. We heard, as you know, the last few days that a new round of discussions, which should start on the 16th day of the ceasefire, will start negotiating other issues. We heard today that actually it's already started. So that's good news too. We want to see that progressing. And part of that process will lead to the issue of governance and the issue of security arrangements. From our perspective, in a nutshell, we consider the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian government as the legitimate sole administrator of Gaza, just like the West Bank. And therefore we expect the one government, one system, one institution, one police force, etc., etc. And we therefore expect that Hamas as a party will not govern. It can be part of the political life, it can be part of the social life, it can be part of the cultural life. So in that regard, we will engage with everybody, not only with Hamas, with all parts of our society, private sector, civil society, in order to rebuild Gaza, rebuild the institutions of Gaza, rebuild the economy of Gaza, establish law and order, and focus on the political track as soon as possible.
Now you have these hundreds of thousands of people in the last few days going back to neighborhoods that have been leveled by the Israeli military in recent months.
Yes.
So the question is, what's going to happen to these folks? President Trump has made a surprising suggestion that they should be temporarily moved somewhere else. Do you think there's any future to this suggestion?
I don't think so, no. I think our people have demonstrated over many years that what they want is to live like any people in the world in their own country. And therefore they're determined to continue to live in Gaza and in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem.
But what if it were temporary, just to sort of make the place, to fix the place up? Do you think you don't trust that?
No, we can fix the place without that.
You don't need to move them.
No, we don't need to move them. What they want, what they need now, and that answers your other part of your question, is immediately providing them with adequate shelter.
Like temporary housing.
Temporary housing. That's what's needed immediately. Because building new homes, so many of them, with the right infrastructure will take time. That's where probably some people concern is coming from. But the answer to that is let's immediately, I mean now, get hundreds of thousands of temporary housing units into Gaza, develop the infrastructure, the water, electricity needed to support that as soon as possible. That should be the priority of the international community in coordination with us.
And to link that to what you said earlier, is your notion that if you have a real rebuilding process that involves the Gulf countries like the Saudis, that it creates a process in which this system can produce a new Palestinian entity?
Absolutely.
That's the goal.
Absolutely. I mean,
it's sort of work on the ground and create a political entity.
Exactly. Work on the ground, help people get out of the misery they are in today.
And that will also shift their political affiliation, maybe.
I think the shifting has already started. We just need to reinforce it, and give people hope, a pathway forward in terms of shelter, basic services restored, including water, electricity, health, education. Work immediately on planning the reconstruction. I'm pleased to report to you that our reconstruction plan is almost ready. We've been working on it with the World Bank, United Nations, and the European Union. Before I met you a few hours ago. They were here, discussed together the plan. So we're ready. So that's what people want. We want, if we can show them that we care about them, and we're doing everything we can as State of Palestine, but also as our partners in the region and international community.
That was the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa speaking exclusively to Bloomberg in Ramallah in the West Bank to Ethan Bronner. So let's bring in Stuart Livingston-Wallace, our executive editor for MENA and Russia. So many things to pick up on, but one thing that stuck out to me was he seemed to support the view that Hamas should not have a place in the future governance or administration of Gaza. But that raises the question, who will be governing Gaza in the future, and should it be the Palestinian Authority?
I mean, they would certainly like it to be, and they did at one stage, but remember, they've been out of Gaza now pretty much for a generation, whatever it is, 18, 19 years. And it's not entirely clear whether the PA has the authority or the popular support to do that. I mean, I think there is widespread support that an armed militant group probably shouldn't be the future government of Gaza. I'm not sure, to what extent that is opposed within Gaza itself. But nonetheless, it's clear that Gaza can't really have a future on the same basis that it did prior to what we've seen with the war.
What did you make of his comments vis-a-vis the Trump administration?
I mean, interesting. Again, he was very measured in all his comments. This was a lengthy interview, very wide-ranging. And at no point, was he anything other than measured and very logical. Again, whether he can get that support, that consensus internationally is a different matter. But in terms of his attitude towards Trump, I think he would like to assume that it's going to be a constructive relationship going forward. Now, there was this meeting between a Palestinian representative and Witkoff, that is Trump's envoy, in Riyadh on Tuesday. And he said that was, reasonably positive. That was a good start, and he's looking forward to more talks. So I think he's hoping that Trump and the Trump administration is someone that he can do business with, someone that he can build a relationship with. Now, there is a long way to go, because I think right now there isn't a great deal of faith in the Palestinian Authority. But again, He's laying out a vision for the future.
And did we get any sense of how he thinks the ceasefire is going to go on for, and whether this ceasefire can actually lead to a durable point of stability in the region and eventually a reconstruction of Gaza?
I mean, I think like everyone else, he's hopeful. I'm not sure that he's making a firm prediction, but he's very much focused on the post-ceasefire scenario and thinking about nation building. I mean, the practical stuff of rebuilding, having hundreds of thousands of homes. What do you do with these hundreds of thousands of people that don't have anywhere? So he was talking about temporary housing. So he really is talking about the practicalities and the potential structure of governance going forward, and what the international partners involved in that might be. And really interesting that he name-checked Saudi Arabia, he name-checked obviously the US administration, really focusing on those two as being two of the key players, but not the only ones.
Yeah. Stuart, thank you so much for the analysis. That was Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, our executive editor from MENA and Russia, on back of the Bloomberg Exclusive with the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister. Now, coming up, mid-air collision, a passenger jet and a military helicopter crash near Washington, D.C.'s Reagan Airport. We'll get you the latest details next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. A passenger jet with 64 people on board has collided midair with a military helicopter in Washington, D.C. A search and rescue operation is underway in the freezing waters of the Potomac River. Bloomberg aviation reporter Danny Lee has been following developments, and he's joining us now. Danny, thanks so much for joining us. This is a fast-moving story. Can you just bring us the latest from what we know about this incident?
Yeah, we're getting some lines now that 18 bodies sadly have been recovered from the Potomac River, and that's according to CBS. We still have no word on how much more that number will grow, but clearly as the hours move on, we may get that. And we will get a press conference, in fact, from Reagan Airport, just outside from where this mid-air collision happened, quite soon at the bottom of the hour. But we've also heard from the American Airlines CEO, Robert Isom. Now, he's expressed his deep sorrow for what has happened. And the American Airlines, one of its jets involved, they're going to be working closely with the NTSB, which is the accident investigators, and also other parties as well. We've also heard from Pete Hegseth, who is the newly installed Defense Secretary. He has said and tweeted, in fact, that there will be an immediate investigation by the Department of Defense and others. So, there is a lot for the new administration to grapple with, and clearly something as tragic as this is real baptism to fire for some of the newly installed people in the administration in Washington right now. But yes, this accident happened, took place around 9 p.m. on Wednesday.
Certainly, and many of them commenting in the new administration. Danny, you cover the transport industry for us here at Bloomberg. Can you just talk about some of the incidents that we've seen in the airline industry over the past few weeks and months? Airline industry still dealing with a lot of incidents more broadly.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because these do capture a lot of attention, and these accidents are still more of an anomaly given how busy, how much activity there is in the aviation space, but particularly around Reagan Airport where this accident took place. The fact is it's a very busy piece of airspace, and particularly the kinds of restricted airspace. As you take off from Reagan Airport, you're very, very close to the likes of the White House, Congress, and even the Pentagon. So it's always been a very popular and busy kind of airport. So, there's always a lot of movements, and obviously the impact from this accident means that it's going to be closed for over a day into Friday until 5 a.m. But still more broadly for the US aviation industry, this is still a very rare accident. We've not had a kind of fatal accident like this since at least 2009. So clearly this is very much an outlier for an industry, a very mature industry in the US, which is pretty robust.
Yeah, and we are waiting for a press conference coming about updates from the scene, but we'll leave it there with you, Danny. Danny Lee, Bloomberg transport reporter with the latest. Thanks so much, Danny. Now, still ahead, we'll get the market outlook with AMP as traders weigh up Fed Chair Jay Powell's rate clues and a round of tech earnings. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. Now, investors are assessing the Fed's rate pause and mixed earnings from U.S. big tech companies that came on Wednesday. Let's bring in Shane Oliver, head of investment strategy and chief economist at AMP. So, Shane, great to get you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. So, it seems a bit, at least from my understanding, that the tech earnings sort of outshined some of the comments that we did get from the Fed on Wednesday. What's your takeaway? What's your assessment of what we heard on Wednesday?
Look, it was a bit of a roller coaster because initially the statement released by the Federal Reserve was somewhat more hawkish than the market expected. So when you look at the S&P, it at one point was down almost 1%. But then, of course, the comments from Jay Powell, the Fed chairperson, were not quite as hawkish, cautious. In no hurry to cut rates, waiting to see what Trump does, but not as hawkish as the statement. So therefore, the market only ended up with a 0.5% decline. So it sort of turned out okay. And I don't know that we really know anything new from the Fed. Yes, they want to see clearer evidence that inflation is continuing to fall, or the labour market is weakening, and they're not in a hurry. But I don't think that message has changed dramatically from what we thought before the meeting. In the great scheme of things, I still think the Fed is on track for a couple of cuts this year, but they may not move in March. It may come a little bit later than that. But a lot does depend on what Donald Trump does on tariffs.
When it comes to tech, Shane, we did hear some of the CEOs actually commenting on DeepSeek. Do you believe that we haven't seen the end of the DeepSeek impact on the tech industry? What do you think sort of the outlook is now moving forward?
Look, to be honest with you, I think we've got a long way to go in relation to the full impact from DeepSeek and the follow-on from that. A lot of the focus is on DeepSeek, but I think it's inevitable at some point that the AI hardware sector in technology will become commoditized. There's already a lot of providers of AI apps, but I think you're going to find a situation where, as with all technology, as with most technology, when it comes on, initially the costs are quite high, it's very prohibitive to get into, and then, of course, innovations occur, competition occurs, and the prices come down and it becomes commoditized, as we've seen with virtually everything in tech. If you've got some network effect where you can lock people in, like maybe Facebook and Windows have done, Microsoft Windows has done, well and good, but I don't think that applies to AI. So I think it's just a sign of the way things are going to go in relation to AI. It's yet to be proved that its costs were as little as they indicated. I think that the process does as well as indicated, almost as good as ChatGPT. But on the cost, a little bit of uncertainty there, but I think this story has a long way to go. And the basic issue is the tech valuations are very rich, and that leaves them vulnerable to further weakness at some point.
Yeah. Shane, let's turn to Australia. The Aussie dollar is the worst performing G10 currency since Trump won the elections, actually. And I do wonder how the weakness of the Aussie dollar is going to play into RBA's thinking. Most analysts seem to think that the RBA are going to go for a cut at the next meeting. But if you continue to have a weakness in the currency, that could be inflationary. So how do you think about those dynamics?
It sure could be. I think the reason it is the weakest G10 currency is because it's, perhaps if you look at expectations regarding what the central banks will do, it's the expectations regarding the RBA in Australia that have become most dovish, whereas other central bank expectations haven't changed much at all, or in some cases might have become a little bit more hawkish or less dovish. So that explains the added weakness for the Aussie dollar. In a great scheme of things, it's down, about 10% against the US dollar, but on a trade-weighted basis, which is what the Reserve Bank looks at, it's down about 5%. And in basically the same range it's been in for the last 4 years. So I don't think it's enough to stop an RBA rate cut in February, but it probably will keep the RBA a little bit cautious. Oftentimes when the RBA moves, it wants to do a couple of moves back-to-back in the same direction. So if they start cutting, normally they'd want to cut again in April. I think this time around, if the Aussie dollar remains softish, which it probably will, then it will be an argument for them pausing in April and then waiting till May and see what happens. But, a 5% fall on a trade-weighted basis, which is what ultimately matters here, is neither here nor there. It's not a big impact. And we saw that big fall in the Aussie dollar through the December quarter, and yet import prices in Australia reported today were only up 0.2%. So I don't see a huge flow on to inflation. And I think inflation is key here, and ultimately it continues to trend down.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good place to leave it. Shane Oliver, Head of Investment Strategy and Chief Economist at AMP, talking through the reaction to the Fed meeting yesterday. DeepSeek, obviously the big story of the week this week, and then a little bit about the RBA and what they may do next, given the disinflationary process that's going on in Australia. A quick look at equity futures, leaning towards the green today. S&P futures up 0.4, NASDAQ up 0.6. Coming up, more from our exclusive interview with the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa. We'll bring you more of that next. This is Bloomberg.
This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. A Bloomberg exclusive. Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa says his government plans to rebuild Gaza with the help of President Trump and Saudi Arabia, with Hamas and Israel removed from the territory. AI dominates big tech earnings, and a new deal emerges. Softbank in talks to invest as much as $25 billion in OpenAI. And a passenger jet with 64 people on board crashes in Washington after a mid-air collision with a military helicopter. It's just gone 7:30 a.m. in South Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg.
And I'm Jumana Versace in Dubai, where it's just gone 9:30 a.m. Welcome to the second hour of Horizons Middle East and Africa. And of course, Jen, we're keeping a close eye on all of the developments coming out of D.C., with CBS reporting not so long ago that 18 bodies have now been recovered in the accident that took place between that American Airlines jet and the military helicopter. So these are some live images right now. And in a couple of minutes, there should be a press conference taking place.
Yeah, and we'll, of course, bring that to the viewers right when that starts. But before we get to that, let's just take a look at markets, because we did mention Wednesday we did get the Federal Reserve decision. We also got a slew of tech earnings after the bell. If we take a look at U.S. equity futures right now, pointing towards a positive open, at least right now. S&P futures up 0.3%. NASDAQ futures up just about 0.6%. Potentially then pointing to a reversal of some of the declines that we did see on Wednesday after we did get that Fed decision. We are waiting for some more earnings coming today. That is, of course, Apple, one of the big ones. Also today, here in the region, we're paying close attention to the South African Reserve Bank. The Rand right now looking pretty steady, waiting for that Reserve Bank decision. We're seeing it right now trading just over 18.54 following the Fed decision, and many economists are expecting a cut today. But still, we're waiting to get some of the messaging from Netanyahu. Jumana, I know you spoke to him last week at Davos about some of that uncertainty that he does see in the U.S. and how that affects the economy here. And Brent crude marginally down right now, still waiting on some clarity from the U.S. administration on trade policy. Of course, there's that February 1st deadline we keep hearing from President Trump, but Brent trading just over $76.52 a barrel. We did see oil prices fall on Wednesday after Trump did comment, Trump's Commerce Secretary, commenting about tariffs on Mexico and Canada not necessarily being a done deal. So we'll see how that pans out. And just broadening out to the oil global crude picture, the EIA, actually, oil report came out on Wednesday indicating that U.S. crude inventories rose for the first time since November and sit at the highest level in nearly 2 months, as this chart is showing. But of course, we've heard from President Trump he wants to drill. So whether or not, or how, I guess, that affects crude prices will be closely watched by investors globally.
Yeah, putting a bit of downward pressure on the energy complex this morning, Jen. All right, well, back to the overnight story. Investors are assessing the Fed's rate pause and mixed earnings from U.S. big tech companies. For more on markets, Luis Costa, Head of Emerging Market Strategy at Citi, joins us now. Luis, always good to talk to you. You know, I'm going to start off with a broad question, leaning on your expertise, looking at emerging markets for many, many years now. How are you thinking about tariffs and the possibility of their implementation on emerging market economies? Are there any emerging market economies that could actually benefit, or is it just a blanket negative?
Well, I mean, it's a general headline shock. It's very difficult to find, one big winner out of the story because effectively it continues basically to prop up the dollar, right? I mean, from that perspective. But we continue to believe that policy is slightly different from the one we saw under Trump 1.0. Will be more tactical, will be more selective. We always have to bear in mind the main objectives of this administration in terms of the first 100 days, right? I mean, which has a lot to do with domestic policy, for example, immigration. So, for example, in Mexico, we don't believe this administration will start already guns blazing in terms of tariff hikes, unless negotiations with Sheinbaum's government go really poorly. But we don't believe this is going to be the case. So it will be a lot more selective, Jomana.
Yeah. Luis, I was reading an analyst report last week, which I think frames the dilemma in front of policymakers in emerging market countries quite well. On one hand, they're going to have to deal with the prospect of perhaps slower growth and slower growth signals coming through from the rest of the world, the U.S. aside. On the flip side, they're going to have to deal with potential financial instability and more difficult financial conditions, namely on back of the strong USD, which is going to have repercussions on EM currencies. So which one do they opt for, financial stability or dealing with growth?
Well, to be honest with you, I think that our preferred answer is both. Policy uncertainty, it will continue. That's the way Trump enacts policy. It will probably continue. We mentioned before, right? It's probably going to be more tactical, more strategic, and negotiations-based if compared to Trump 1.0. But, you know, if we have an index of policy uncertainty, and there are quite a few out there, you're going to see that, you know, over the past quarter, we've been rising, and it will remain high. So that, generally speaking, in terms of emerging markets, that keeps the interest rate premium in the back end of the curves quite high. So we do believe that, I mean, many credit curves and many local curves, when it comes to the credit components, these curves will tend to be a little bit steeper, right? There's a big difference between the commodities and the industrials. We do believe that industrials and EM economies, they probably tend to be a little bit more in danger, like Central European, you know, the China complex, the Koreas of the world, because we know that tariff policies will probably be a little bit more detrimental to these economies if compared to commodity economies, right? But you mentioned the growth aspects. I mean, let's not forget, in a tariff war situation, which is extreme to our scenarios here, you're going to see a decrease in volumes, right? So that per se is already an indicator of lower growth or lower output generation for the EM economy. So as we said before, it's very difficult to find a winner from the EM in the current environment.
Luis, if you can you talk about South Africa in particular? We mentioned, this is Jennifer, by the way, we mentioned the SARB is meeting later today. Could potentially South Africa be absolved of some of this concern that you're seeing broader for EM, or what's the picture here for you?
I like the term absolved. Yeah, it's we do believe that South Africa, I mean, as I mentioned, a part of the commodities complex in EM, and most importantly, an extremely cautious central bank. It's not like the SARB turned cautious very recently. SARB policy is already inherently cautious, and investors know that. We are calling for a 25 basis points cut in this meeting, but it's not going to be back-to-back. It's not going to be a long easing cycle. And let's not forget, this is a central bank that has been already signaling with lower inflation targets. Perhaps it's still in 2025, we believe, towards the back end of this year or beginning of the next year. So the kind of, in terms of the policy anchor is very strong. South Africa is coming out of a period of depressed growth, given the problems with energy and power generation, right? And now the outlook is definitely improving. So that will probably increase or improve the outlook, the growth outlook for South Africa. So we still believe that South Africa is one of those jurisdictions in EM that is now in a small rosy cycle, right? Where you can calibrate credit premium down, and the policy anchor from the central bank point of view will be there. So we do like the bonds. We do like the value of the bonds. I mean, obviously, the rand will be a more difficult business given the broad dollar environment and the broad dollar assumptions we have now.
All right. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Luis, I feel like we could speak to you forever, but we'll have to get you back on. Luis Costa, Head of Emerging Market Strategy at Citi. Luis, thank you so much for your insights this morning. Now, let's get some more from our exclusive interview with the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister. Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa says they're relying on the support of Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region in the massive task of rebuilding Gaza.
Saudi Arabia has said that openly and publicly, that they want to engage, they want to have a more integrated, more peaceful region. But they also said that without the Palestinian statehood issue is addressed in the right way, nothing will happen.
Right.
So we do count on the support of our brothers in Saudi Arabia and the region. And of course, many countries around the world that has been supportive of our cause and Palestinian statehood. As you know, we have about 149 countries do recognize Palestine, despite all the challenges and difficulties and etc. So we have every reason to believe that this is doable. It is tough, it is difficult, but maybe the time has finally come.
So if the time has come, it's going to have to run through Washington with the new Trump administration. This is a delicate situation for you because the PA's relationship with the Trump administration, the last Trump administration, was somewhat strained. Tell us how it's going in the first weeks of this administration.
I think I have every reason to believe that this administration will actually help us all do the right deal, a balanced deal that could hopefully end the conflict in the region.
And do you have that feeling because of a relationship that you've started with the president or with people around him?
Well, I think, as I said, I mean, the good news here, if you like, is that there's the bilateral dimension, but there is also the regional dimensions and the global dimension. Everybody in the world now wants to see Palestinians have their own state. Everybody in Europe wants to see that. Many people in the U.S., but also many people in the United Nations system and many countries in the region. So it's a public, it's kind of the right thing to do, if you like. And I think the momentum that we have seen, even before the administration officially started on January 20th, their engagement from day one, as you know, Steve Witkoff is in the region. He will probably in Gaza today, as he said.
Yes, he was.
So that shows engagement and interest, and he's obviously taken time to discover the place and learn about what's going on. And I'm sure that this will be very helpful.
That was Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa speaking exclusively to Bloomberg's Ethan Bronner in Ramallah. Now, coming up, the ECB is expected to cut by 25 basis points today. We are live in Frankfurt with a preview next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Well, turning to Europe now, the ECB is expected to lower interest rates for a fifth meeting as inflation that's nearing the 2% target lets officials further loosen the shackles on the economy. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden joins us from outside the ECB in Frankfurt. So the market is pretty done. It's set pretty much in terms of market and expectations that they're going to go for a 25 basis point rate cut today. But I guess the bigger question, Lizzie, is what signals we're going to get about the future path for interest rates today.
Absolutely. It feels a bit, Joanna, like the ECB is on autopilot at this meeting and the next one in March, that we're on a gradual path in a dovish direction. Gradual, the word used by Christine Lagarde in Davos. And as you say, the point really is that they need to ease policy to resuscitate the euro area economy, especially France and Germany, given how beleaguered they are by their own politics. But if we look beyond this, the real battleground will be April. So, yes, unanimously, economists expect this quarter-point cut today. Despite all the hints on the Governing Council, we're not, most economists, expecting Christine Lagarde to drop hints about March. But April, the real question, because by then we'll hopefully have more of an idea about Trump's tariffs on Europe, although, of course, they can change with the stroke of a pen. We'll have the quarterly updated economic projections for the ECB, and we'll have the result of the German election. So we can factor in all of those outcomes by that point. But this is where it starts to get hairy. So you've got a debate on the Governing Council with the doves like François Villeroy de Gallo prepared to take the deposit rate to 2% by June. You've got hawks like Klaas Knot not willing to, or yet to say that they are. But as we get closer to 2%, because this is the rate where most think it's neutral interest rates, that's when the debate really starts hotting up.
Well, Lizzie, the Eurozone saw a surprise inflation print to the upside back in December. How is that likely to get factored into today's decision-making?
Well, isn't it strange that they've kind of brushed that off, an uptick in December to 2.4%, but yet there is concern about services inflation in the euro area. This was kind of the common theme throughout our conversations with ECB policymakers in Davos. I know you were there on the ground, Johanna, as well. But this is going to be a key question at the press conference to Christine Lagarde. How far is the ECB away from declaring victory? That's one. Where is the neutral rate? And the other is about euro-dollar parity, because this is something that we've been talking about a lot. It's been more and more priced into markets. But as this gap opens up between the ECB and the Fed, it looks like you're going to have a weaker euro, a stronger dollar, and that feeding back into the inflation story. I expect if Christine Lagarde's asked about this in the press conference, she'll say that classic old line, we are data dependent, not Fed dependent.
Yeah, that is one of her signature lines. You're right. Lizzie Burden in Frankfurt, thank you so much for the ECB preview. Well, coming up, the DRC's president warns of unpredictable consequences after Rwandan-backed rebels seized the eastern city of Goma. More on the international response to the conflict next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasanja in Johannesburg. The Democratic Republic of Congo President Felix Tshisekedi is warning of, quote, unpredictable consequences for the region. That's after Rwandan-backed rebels seized the eastern city of Goma. Tshisekedi says his government is preparing a response to the conflict. Meanwhile, Rwanda denies the backing of rebels or having troops in Congo.
M23 are not Rwandans, please. These are Congolese, and one time he accepts it, then another time he says no, part of it is yes, and then the other part is from Rwanda, and these are the. He keeps on going. And how do we, leaders of our own countries, accept this to go on forever?
For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Andira Oganga, who's joining us now from Kigali, Rwanda. So, Andira, what stood out to you from the extraordinary Heads of State Summit organized by President Ruto? This is, again, evolving quite quickly.
Hi, Jen. So you could see that President Paul Kagame was visibly frustrated, not just with the fighting in DRC, but how Rwanda has been roped into all this. International bodies, including the UN and the US, have accused Rwanda of backing M23 rebels, an allegation that the president has denied over and over and over again. And it looks like this narrative is beginning to seep into the region and causing division. There was a lot of finger-pointing and exchanging of blames behind closed doors, with President Paul Kagame putting it into context and saying his South African counterpart, Cyril Ramaphosa, reached out to him him to have a conversation regarding the fighting in DRC, but the context of that conversation has been heavily distorted in the media by South African officials. And he says, I quote, if South Africa wants to contribute to a peaceful solution, that is well and good. But South Africa is in no position to take on the role of peacemaker or mediator. And this is after South Africa lost 13 soldiers, and pressure is mounting back at home. The other elephant in the room was that DRC's president was visibly missing from this meeting. Instead, he addressed the nation through a televised address and called for resilience, but also resistance.
Yeah, we haven't actually seen those two leaders meeting yet in the same room since this started. Andiro, when we talk about the situation in eastern Congo, where are we at right now, just a few days into that reported takeover of Goma?
Jenny Sabago makes goods. There's some who are hopeful at the beginning.
Andiro, I'm so sorry. We have to leave it there with you. We've been paying close attention to what is happening in the U.S. with this breaking story on the plane collision in Washington, D.C. We're going to take you now live to that press conference at Washington's Reagan Airport.
I'm Muriel Bowser. I'm the mayor of Washington, D.C. I'm at Reagan National Airport. I am joined by United States Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, United States Senator Jim Moran, Senator Roger Marshall, Jack Potter, the CEO of the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. We are here to brief you on the very tragic events of this evening, where we know a passenger plane coming to the airport here collided with a military helicopter. Our fire department, DC Fire and EMS, supported by fire departments and police departments from across the Washington metropolitan region, are executing a rescue operation in the Potomac River. They are working diligently in very dark and cold conditions, cold water, to execute this rescue operation. We have had the opportunity to be briefed by American Airlines officials. I'm told that American Airlines leadership is on the way to Washington as well. And officials are in the airport talking to families now. We do have a 1-800 number where families should contact us, should contact American Airlines for more information, and we will be providing that information shortly. I am going to turn to a number of officials to provide as much information as we can this evening, and we expect to have more frequent briefings at daylight. So with that, I'm going to turn to Secretary Duffy.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser. I think for all of us, we want to extend our thoughts and prayers to those individuals who were impacted by the events tonight, their families. We know this is a very difficult time for all of them. I want to join the mayor and everyone here too, extending our thank you to the first responders who, again, in very difficult situations and environments, are out there searching and attempting to rescue. Tonight, I spoke with President Trump and his team in the Situation Room. I had a conversation with Secretary Pete Hegseth as well.
All right, we're just listening to a press conference that is taking place at Reagan Airport. Just hearing words from Muriel Bowser, the Washington mayor, on back of the mid-air crash that took place just a couple of hours ago. A plane carrying 64 people collided with a military helicopter. Stay tuned for further developments as the morning goes on. That's it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Versace in Dubai with Jennifer and Johannesburg.